Great. All right, this is on. Fantastic. Thank you and good morning, everyone. This is my first PDF. I'm excited to be here. Huge thanks to Andrew and Mika and the whole team for having us here. As you said, this builds on, I think, a long history of Microsoft being a partner to this important venue. It's also great to be back in New York. I used to live here for a number of years while I was working up at the UN, just up the road before joining Microsoft. It's always great to be here. And I promise I will not throw anything at anyone. So just want to point that out. That was a great moment. So with that, let's get started. I'm going to walk you through a few ideas and concepts that we have put on the table and some new programs we're developing. And then very happy to take questions afterwards about that or anything else. So as Andrew already pointed out, the threat of cyber conflict, and there's lots of different words being used, cyber warfare. I personally prefer cyber conflict because not all of it is sort of technically from a legal perspective in the warfare domain, certainly increasing. And I think when you look at sort of data that's available purely from public reporting, this is nothing proprietary, it gives you a sense of the attacks that are being described, at least in the media, presumably or allegedly carried out by nation-state actors. And I think that is a trend that we all need to be concerned about. We ask about how we make good. I would say nation-states building offensive cyber capabilities certainly are not on the road to making good in that space. And so I think from our perspective, when we look at how these attacks have evolved over time, one of the things that we're really concerned about is the outsized impact that these attacks are having on our societies. And this does not only affect large corporations and businesses, but increasingly targets critical infrastructures and beyond that, democratic processes and institutions that affect and underpin really the system that we all have come to enjoy. And so I think when we look at some of these examples, everybody is of course looking at the 2016 elections, but there are many other examples when you look at Europe, what happened to the French campaign cycle, where President Macron's campaign in particular was targeted, but actually also some of the other campaigns. When you look at what happened in Germany with the German parliament being hacked, allegedly some of the national referenda, look at Brexit, look at what happened in Spain. Again, not all of this has been conclusively proven, but there is a clear trend where systems are either getting probed or they're getting hacked directly. And so this timeline, I think, is emblematic of this trend, and it's something that's hugely concerning to us. When we take that one step further, there's a lot of, I think, concern, but also sort of different terms being used in terms of what this means for impacting our democratic processes and institutions. And we came across this framework by the New America Foundation, which I think actually provides a fairly solid taxonomy in terms of what we need to be concerned about. On the one hand, there is the manipulation of votes themselves. And this really, at the end of the day, is sort of a data integrity issue. Foreign actors interfering with things like vote tabulation, the proper recording of votes of an election, and essentially disrupting the ability for all of us to have our votes cast in the way that they were intended to be cast. The second, of course, is the manipulation of voters, and I think that's something we've clearly seen over the last couple of years, and that relates to sort of the broader disinformation space. And I think it's important to distinguish between these two because ultimately the threats clearly are emerging as hybrid, and many of the operations we've seen actually have both components to them. But ultimately, I think there are different solutions to some degree that we need to apply to these categories, and so it's important to call them out and describe them properly. And then the third aspect, I think, is one of sort of more general disruption, where you could face disruption through cyber means. For example, on election day, if you there's lots of concerns about systems underpinning the electoral process, broadly speaking, not just the vote tabulation, as well as things like news media, election-related reporting. Oftentimes we find that many of these organizations do not use cybersecurity best practices, have not practiced what's sort of called cyber hygiene, and are vulnerable to manipulation and attack. And so this trifecta of threats, I think, is something we all need to be concerned about. And so what are we doing at Microsoft? You've heard Andrew speak about a little bit the sort of long-standing efforts that Microsoft has had and many initiatives in sort of the broader civic tech space. And we're continuing to move that forward. But we are also sort of reinvigorating it with a new focus on cybersecurity and protecting our democratic institutions. And so 2 months ago, we launched a new program called what we're calling the Defending Democracy Program. And kind of looking at what I just described in terms of the taxonomy of threats, we are convinced that we need to try and bring to bear solutions and ultimately have a responsibility to try and contribute addressing threats that are sort of targeting these 4 areas. One, election integrity issues, I think, are hugely important as they relate to the systems that underpin our institutions and electoral processes. Second, working with political campaigns to make sure that we keep them secure. Oftentimes what we find, campaigns tend to sort of, as you all are well familiar, are almost sort of startup enterprises, maybe small and medium businesses, but with enterprise cybersecurity needs. And that's a tough one to address from sort of a broad corporate structure. And so we're going to have a focused and dedicated effort to really look into what we can do specifically to secure political campaigns. The third is the issue of advertising transparency. I think that's on everybody's mind. How do we actually move our industry to become more transparent in the context of online advertising? There's lots of interesting steps that are being discussed at the moment. From our perspective, there are certain things on the policy side that need to happen. We've supported and come out in support of the Honest Ads Act. Excuse me. But there's also a number of self-regulatory issues that I think we need to think about from a perspective of really moving our industry forward in ways that ensures greater transparency when it comes to who actually purchases advertising and making it clear that we have the transparency that's needed, similar to what you have in terms of rules in the offline advertising world. And then 4, it's a topic that gets a lot of attention, but as I said earlier, we believe it's not the only topic that we need to address, which is this question of sort of disinformation and identification, really, of junk news, fake news, if you want to use that term. In particular, also by bringing to bear technology that can help, for example, with identifying things like deep fakes. We're somewhat at the beginning of that, both on the threat side, but also bringing to bear technology to help address some of those threats. So that's how we're thinking about our new Defending Democracy program. And in terms of the value that we want to uphold here, I think, if you asked why are we concerned about this, ultimately I think from our perspective, protecting our democratic institutions, protecting our democratic processes is a critical foundation for the resilience of our societies. I think, if anything, the last couple of years have shown that oftentimes we might, both as companies but also more broadly as society, have taken some of this resilience aspect taken that for granted. And I think we all need to do more to make sure we bolster that resilience. And just as our adversaries, I want to use technology to do bad things, to impact our democratic societies. We really want to leverage technology to help defend democracy. And I think, again, there is a lot more that we can do. There's a lot more that all of us in industry can do to actually leverage technology in that sense. And I think you'll see a number of things that we hope to roll out over the next few months in that space. Clearly, we want to play a leadership role. As I said, we've had a number of efforts at the company that have focused on things in sort of various aspects. We want to be more programmatic about it, bring those together, and be a leader in in how we do that. And I think one of the important lessons that we've learned over the last few years is it's critical to be nonpartisan in our efforts. And that is true both for what we do here in the US, but also internationally. And with that, I think we're also clear that we want to be able to make a difference, not just here, but on a global scale. Because ultimately, as a global company, we feel like we have a global responsibility. And building on that, sort of talking about the threats is one thing. We also want to talk about solutions. And I think what you will hear us say, and from our President Brad Smith on down, industry in our mind really has the first responsibility to address these challenges. And so that starts with actually developing systems that are secure from the ground up. That requires us to bolster our defenses. We spend over $1 billion a year on cybersecurity at Microsoft. If you put that, which is a big number, now if you put that in context though with nation states spending billions of dollars on cyber offense, all of a sudden, there's a question of how much we as one company can achieve in that space. But because of that, or in light of that, we earlier this year, actually a couple of months ago as well, around the time of the RSA Security Conference, announced a cybersecurity tech accord. And we brought together, at this point, I think we're up to 40 companies to essentially commit to 4 pretty basic principles. But it hadn't been done before, and we felt like it was important, and it was an important moment in time to actually bring industry together. And so on the first principle is one of simply saying we need stronger defense. We all need to invest more in securing our systems. Second, no offense. We will not enable any government or any customer anywhere to conduct offensive activity against another customer. 3, we want to build capacity for those that don't have sufficient cybersecurity capacity, and there are a number of really interesting initiatives going on. And then 4, it's time for more collective action, because ultimately cybersecurity in many ways is a collective action problem. Every actor sort of acts in their own self-interest, and we haven't yet found a way to come together both across industry in a more meaningful way, but also between governments and industry. And so, again, in that 4th bucket is where you'll see some additional industry initiatives rolling out in the next few months. But industry can't do it alone. And because of that, we have been calling for a little over a year now for what we call a digital Geneva Convention. And it builds a little bit on the talk that was given just before the break, of which I was able to catch part of, in terms of this notion of thinking about new governance models, really. And I think this one actually is sort of maybe a hybrid to some degree. We are convinced that governments ultimately need to come together and declare what the rules of the road should be when it comes to what is permissible in cyberspace and cyber offense. Interfering with political systems, interfering with an election in other nation states, in our mind, should clearly be out of bounds. There are a number of other rules that I think we need to discuss, but we can't rely on the fact that governments alone will do that and will do that effectively. And so I think one of the important things to us is the question of how do we build a global movement around the notion that we want to keep cyberspace secure. We want to make sure that nobody interferes in the democratic processes using technology. And we want to get to that place in a fairly sort of defined time frame and not wait for, I think, sort of the decades it typically takes for an international agreement to get formed. And we've seen some examples in that space that have been really successful. If you look at some of the movements around banning landmines, for example, even the climate change accords, some really interesting models out there for how industry and governments, frankly, but not just industry and governments, for non-state actors, I would say, have pressured governments to act and come together. The last point, and I'll end on that because I think I have about a half a minute left, is this question of trying to actually increase the accountability of governments in this space. Part of the challenge behind all of this is you can have an attack launched without a shot fired, as you said, and really not be held accountable, because ultimately it is fairly easy to conceal who actually is the originator of an attack. And so what we've called for actually is to start thinking about building up a global mechanism, an international mechanism, that can help improve cyber attack attribution. And that's, again, one where governments are doing some of this to date, but they aren't sharing sources and methods, of course. They aren't necessarily being very credible about how they got to their assessments. And so we're saying, let's work together, industry, civil society, researchers, folks in universities that are looking into these issues, and let's build a global or an international organization that can actually harness the data that exists as it relates to cyber attack attribution and bring it together in a much more meaningful way. So those are some ideas I wanted to put on the table. I'll end with a quote that I think is sort of emblematic of what we're trying to lay out here, and this is sort of in the concluding statement of a report by Madeleine Albright and Ibrahim Gambari, who talk about the need for new kinds of institutions and really sort of new kinds of governance to try and address security, but also social justice and governance challenges. I highly recommend that report if you haven't seen it. And so with that, I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
So get your Slido questions up, please. And but I'll quickly ask one, which is on your last point about nation states and accountability. What do we do about non-state actors? Because in this particular, when you can sign a global climate change accord, if nation states don't sign it, as was pointed out earlier, cities and other entities might sign it. But if there's some big pollution happening somewhere, it's visible, it's traceable. If you have nation states sign an accord, you have corporations sign an accord, everyone agrees to abide by these new rules. What do we do about the non-state actors who are infiltrating these networks and are anonymous? How do you protect yourself then?
That's a great question, and I think it gets to the one of the key challenges we have in this space, which is the evolution of the threats that we're seeing, right? Oftentimes you will have non-state actors, third-party groups that will sort of function as criminal hacker groups out for financial, sort of financially motivated purposes one week, and then they'll be deputized by their government the next week and sort of act on behalf of a government. And that's sort of on the one hand, it's professionalizing cybercrime, and on the other hand, it gives plausible deniability to governments to say, well, this wasn't a nation-state operation, this was sort of a patriotic hacker. What are you talking about? And so I think it is very, very challenging. But one of the ways to actually think about addressing that is, I talked about increasing attribution. The fact of the matter is there's a lot of data that exists today, both in large corporations, but also there's some really important research going on in universities and elsewhere. But there really isn't a single methodology. There isn't a way to kind of bring these things together holistically. And so what we've been thinking about is to try and think about ways that one might actually do that, A, and B, when it comes to attribution, there's many different ways one can actually trace back malicious activity. It doesn't always have to be ascribing something to a particular government actor. You could simply say, this activity is emanating from a particular territory, you government X, go and clean this up and stop this activity, right? And so I think there are many different ways of how to think about that. There are things that can be done publicly or in private. There are organizations like the International Red Cross that could be empowered to do more. There's many different ideas on the table, and I think we just need to get moving.
So we lost the Slido for some reason, but I did see a question there related to, there it is. Is it unrealistic to expect companies like Facebook to take real actions to protect democracy when those actions conflict with the company's business model?
I cannot speak for Facebook.
We're not asking you to speak, we're just companies like Facebook. By the way, Facebook is a sponsor, and they're here actually to listen and participate, and we're very happy about that. But
where's the Facebook person?
But no, actually, this is a really important point. You might wonder, you saw these companies issued before, right? They're sponsors of ours, right? But they are actually, they're part of the systems. We're all part of the systems in some cases that have caused some of these problems. And here's an opportunity of exchange and learning, and that's why we're really happy to have our sponsors here participating and leadership being shown by these companies. But it's true, the business model, the basic business model, is broken. It's not aligned with the goals that you've subscribed to. So how do we get the business models to line up with these, in effect, Geneva-like conventions?
Yeah. So I'd say two things. One, again, can't comment on Facebook. I would say Facebook has a very different business model compared to our business model, and so I think there's a clear difference there. That said, when we talk about threats against our customers and in the broader ecosystem, we have over 1 billion Windows endpoints. We have a very large presence, not just on Windows, but also in sort of hyperscale cloud computing. And ultimately, when you are one of the leading global cloud providers in particular, I would argue there is, to some degree, an overlap between sort of systemic interests and our interests as a corporation, which clearly is about keeping ourselves and our customers safe. And I think it's always fascinating for us when we discuss these questions, be it with large corporations, but also with very influential voices in sort of the NGO and think tank and research community. There's large agreement on the principles that we're advocating. Now, whether you call this a Geneva Convention or something else, I think the important moment here, or the important sort of aspect here is this call to action. And to your earlier point, we don't want to wait until we get to a moment where we have a large cyber-enabled catastrophe until we take action.
So the second question actually sort of touches on this a little bit more specifically to Microsoft. So we're not asking you to comment on Facebook this time. We're asking you to comment on Microsoft, which is, how does Microsoft make sure that this is a sustainable effort on your part? You'll be criticized, or people will assume Microsoft's only doing this to make money a new way. That they're doing this because they're a corporation and their job is to make money and to satisfy their shareholders. So this is a really important effort. It sounds broadly benevolent. We're very happy that you're taking that effort, but how is it going to be sustained in a way that it doesn't tie it to profit?
Sure. That's a very good question, and I would answer a couple different ways. One, we're doing this because we feel, and I think this is from the sort of leadership on down, this is the right thing to do, this is an important thing to do, and ultimately it's all about sustaining trust in technology, I would say. So I think that is, broadly speaking, a key factor here. But certainly, this is not something that we're making money off of. Our program is a cost center. I can be open about that. And I think we are fortunate, I think, to be part of a company that not only has our leadership with Brad and Satya caring about these issues in fundamental ways, but there's a lot of enthusiasm actually across the company to be able to work on something that is greater than just maybe one individual product.
All right. So the third question is sort of, I think, sort of implies an obvious answer. Obviously, if Microsoft is providing services of various kinds, there's an advantage because you have a relationship, you understand the customer in a way that others may not. So that clearly allows for a relationship to exist that goes beyond the cybersecurity. But let's go to the next question, which sort of says, what needs to happen to get more companies to sign on to your initiative, so this can be as open a process and that as many organizations as possible could benefit from being more aware of this need, not just Microsoft.
Mm-hmm. No, great question, and I think, excuse me, from our perspective, we're happy to be an instigator. We want to bring companies, but also ideally other actors together in this in this space. But this really shouldn't be about Microsoft, right? Ultimately, it's about trying to make a difference in the ecosystem. And so we have actually taken every opportunity we can get to talk to other companies about, for example, coming on board and signing up to the Tech Accord, which we think is sort of a foundational moment for industry. That's one. We're in constant discussions at the moment. I think the slide said something about 30 companies. We're now up to over 40. There's a large effort underway to actually internationalize that further. So it's not just U.S. companies. There's a number of European companies in there. We're talking to a number of sort of industry colleagues in Asia about this, because the concern is global, right? This is not something limited to a particular part of the world. Many countries around the world are dependent on securing their digital infrastructure, and I think there's a lot of willingness to think about ways that we can work better together. Is this going to solve all problems? Absolutely not. But I think it is an important first step, and also, frankly, increasing pressure on governments to kind of say, look, if industry can come together, you governments better be able to come together, and you need to be the ones who make the rules in this space. But we want to be able to push them in that
Maybe
direction.
we can convince them. Maybe we can convince them to use Democracy Earth as the mechanism for the voting on those ideas. There's going to be a workshop that Jan is going to lead this afternoon. So on this particular topic, if you're of interest, I encourage you to go because you'll be able to get in a little deeper and also ask some questions we didn't have time for. But with that, Jan, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks so much. Thanks.